Hello, friends. Welcome. So here we are again. We're looking at chapter 4 today, part 1 of chapter 4 of the Bhagavad Gita. I am Jacqui. Here's my father, Michael. I think if you're at chapter 4, you've been journeying with us from the beginning, so we probably don't need introductions at this point. So we hope you've been traveling well. Before we launch into today's episode, I just wanted to touch on the exercise that Michael gave us in the last episode, which was whenever we remember, as we're moving through our daily lives, try and observe what the desire was behind our thoughts, our actions, what we said, what we did. So it was one of those observational exercises in just really tuning in to our motivation behind whatever we were doing, thinking, speaking, saying, behaving, all of that. I think I might have remarked at the time that that's a lifelong exercise and we had a giggle about that. So for those of you that might have remembered to practice, I'm wondering how you went. I think these exercises are so pertinent to the process of self-awareness and self-growth. And I wish that in this moment it was one of those conversational kind of moments where we could all talk and share somewhat of our experience. But alas, it's the two of us here at the moment, and you'll be listening by the time this one gets published. But I just wanted to share one little snippet out of my past week where that particularly came to play. So I've recently started a new job. It's a challenging role, it's a role I've not had before. I've only been in it a few weeks, and there was a huge, significant drama at work, well, not a drama, an issue that needed swift action and resolution. And all of the main people that would have normally been able to assist weren't there. And so this enormous new task fell on me as a new staff member within a new organization having a new role. And it was the kind of thing that if it had probably happened to me 6 months ago, I just would have completely panicked and my whole stress response would have gone off in an alarmist manner. And I just had a moment of thinking, there are no managers around. This is my task to complete. It's like I just talked myself into a zone within a split few seconds, and just kept reminding myself, keep to the task. Don't let the drama rise. Don't let the stress rise. Just keep to the task. And there were a lot of obstacles. So I had to reach out to IT. I had to reach out to different people. But every time I hit an obstacle, I would just calmly think to myself, what is the next best step? If I can't resolve this myself, who is going to be the best person or team that might be able to help me? It was a huge task and it got done, and there were a few small errors here and there, but by and large, it was a huge success. And for me personally, I couldn't help but pause at the end of that and almost want to high five myself and just think that was fantastic, because my overactive nervous system would have normally flared and gone into overdrive. It's perhaps a little different from that example, but it's still that observational capacity, really tuning in. And I suppose in a way it is related in that my desire was intensely to stay calm and cool and collected and just get this job done. So I was really pleased with myself. I also know there's moments in life where I've had where things totally go the other way, and I'm less in control than I would have liked to have been. But that one felt for me a particularly relevant life moment and related to this task. So thank you, Michael, for setting such a useful task. I'm hoping that those who practiced at home found it beneficial. And I'm not sure if you want to comment to the task or just launch us into chapter 4, but in whatever direction you take us, we're all ears and happy to launch into this week's episode.
Hello to you, Jackie, and hello to all our listeners. And it's lovely to be with you all again. No, it's a lovely sharing of putting the teachings, the new knowledge you're gaining into practice and observing it and seeing how successful that turned out. Being in the now, tending to the need, and that prompts you to go down the path that you did. And it's also very useful in today's context with the material I'll be looking at, in that we're looking at this in this chapter on wisdom, the Yoga of Wisdom, chapter 4, which I'll elaborate in over the next few minutes to tie in with what you're saying. So that the word wisdom is a very critical word in this chapter, the entire chapter. It's titled Yoga of Wisdom, so obviously it's important. But I want to elaborate on that word specifically because There's a lot of misconceptions about it, but it'll unfold in the material I've sort of put together, Jackie, so I'll just expand on that. But it ties in that there's the knowledge, then there's the application of it, like the practical application. So that's the action. So knowledge and action then lead to wisdom. Many people think wisdom is knowledge, but that's not true. That's not true. All right. So today's podcast begins with the first part of chapter 4, and we'll briefly cover some of these topics in, as I say, briefly. One will be this topic of wisdom itself. The next topic is the self is the eternal teacher. And number 3 will be how self relates to action. So the self here is capital S self, Jackie, the higher self in our being. And that's where you were operating from in this example that you shared with the listeners. So the chapter is titled The Yoga of Wisdom. The term yoga means union, the act of connecting our lower self with our higher self through one's own evolution or spiritual journey. Any method by which the lower in us is educated and trained to live a higher way of life, where we gain a more effective control over both our life externally and our life internally, is called yoga. And by extension, a yogi is a person like us seeking truth through yoga. So people have probably heard of the word yoga, but usually associated with the physical aspect of yoga. But we've been looking at yoga of action. Now we're looking yoga of wisdom, and the next chapter will be the yoga of enunciation. So yoga meaning pathways which lead to union. And so you can see for the example there that I mentioned in here that the lower in us is educated and trained to live and operate at a higher way of life, which is what I think you described in your situation in your new job. So the word wisdom is a very important word, listeners and Jackie, which is often misinterpreted as simply meaning a lot of knowledge, either in general or in a specific area. And this is just not correct. It's totally false to have that idea or thinking that the two are equated. They're vastly different, and it needs to be understood very, very clearly. So I'll go on to elaborate a little bit more about it. The word wisdom originates from 2 Latin words, wis meaning wise and dom meaning judgment. So we end up with the word wisdom truly meaning being able to make wise judgments in our lives. Now, wise judgments is different to knowledgeable judgments, and it's different to judgments coming from an emotional aspect, Jackie, or from an intellectual aspect. We're looking at making fundamental changes in our way of living and wanting to operate. If I asked you and asked all the listeners, would you like to be a wiser person? What would be your answer?
I'm sure it would be a
Of
resounding
course,
yes.
every person on the planet would say, "Oh yes, I want to be wiser." Well, that's lovely, and I know they'd say that, and it's good that that's there. But everyone has to also realise that you don't just become wiser. No one waves a magic wand. There's no magic dust sprinkled around or something, and you pray for wisdom or this or that. It has to be learned and it has to be practiced. And so that's why I'm stressing that it's a very, very critical word, because in the end, through wisdom, we make better judgments, wise judgments. Wise also means truthful. So we're trying to operate at this higher level that we're capable of operating, Jackie and listeners, and that is operate as truthfully as we can. Whereas most of the time, most people, and us included at different stages, have been operating and leading our lives through a falsity and what's called an illusion. We think it's all true, but all of our ideas and most of our ideas, most of our beliefs and opinions are erroneous. They're not based on wisdom. So we need to understand that clearly, and that's why it's very early in the teachings of Krishna, so that this will be continuously expanded again over the coming podcasts. So which means for us that one needs true knowledge in order to make a truthful and wise decisions in all aspects of our lives, which I've just alluded to. And so thus in chapter 4, the chapter we're looking at now, and this is the first part of it, incorporates or integrates firstly the knowledge that he taught Arjuna, which is us, in chapter 2, with in chapter 2. With the action, that is, putting that knowledge into practice, and that's the homework you just referred to in chapter 3. And then that leads us now into chapter 4, which is making us wiser individuals. So we've already referred to those two main ingredients, the action and the knowledge and putting it into action. And then that leads into the wisdom. So in chapter 4 now, with the dawn of wisdom, the seeker's next introduced to the concept of renunciation, commonly referred to as letting go or non-attachment, which will be covered now in next chapter, chapter 5. And this connects it to chapter 6, which culminates in the teachings of meditation being a key aspect of realization of the self. So you can see, Jacqui, how the different pieces of it, like a jigsaw, are coming together. He's given us knowledge. He's given us advice on action. Now he's giving us advice on how to become wiser. To be wiser, you've got to let go, renounce a lot of things that are incorrect in our being. And then on top of that, in chapter 6, we'll be introduced to meditation, which is a critical aspect of it all, because to operate from wisdom, we need to be very, very still. And that, so, you know, I'm covering here chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 in broad text, so that listeners can get an understanding of what we've already covered, what we're covering now in these two podcasts, and what we'll be covering in the next two chapters. Is that all right, Jacqui?
And so succinctly done. I was just going to, say that for anyone, even if they're new to this material, that it just shows the beautifully sequential nature of the teachings, and that they're like solid building blocks. It's not that we can even learn each chapter and grasp it in its entirety and come to the end of the text or this podcast series, or study and be completely and utterly transformed, although we may have huge transformations along the way. But it's just that reminder that it's so logical, it's so sensible, and it builds one component upon another, which for me, I find very reassuring. I'm hoping for our listeners as well that it makes sense, and it offers that that path of reassurance.
I'm sure they are, Jacqui. Instinctively, even if they're not thinking it sort of directly, instinctively they're understanding and comprehending that they're already picking up on it, that there's a sequence, and there is definitely obviously it's coming from the higher source, so it's got to be correct, but there's a purpose and there's a reason why all the chapters are where they are. There's a purpose why 6 chapters on us, 6 chapters on the divine, and then 6 chapters bringing the mortal and the immortal together. So it's all precise, it's all accurate, and it all works beautifully. All right, that's good. So we can see here, Jacqui, how Krishna is beginning to bring together the separate aspects of his teachings. What we're looking at here in chapter 4, listeners, is like a simple mathematical equation. You're all familiar, right, from learning at school, that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Yeah, it's an equation. 2 and the plus and something else equals something else. So that mathematical equation transfers now to what I've just been discussing, these words. So knowledge plus action equals wisdom. So that's how one becomes wiser and accumulates wisdom. There has to have those two components, the knowledge and putting it into practical application of it, and that makes us wiser. If you don't do that equation, you can't say you're a wise person. You can say you're a knowledgeable person and have a lot of knowledge, and that's fine. You can say you're an action person and you do a lot of actions, and that's fine. But unless you can combine them together and understand and observe that they go together and what the result is when you put them together, well, then you become a wiser person. And that means also, by extension, that you're a more truthful person. So you're truthful to yourself, you're wiser, and it'll be of obvious benefit to yourself, And in the work situation that you described in your first example, you'll be a benefit to the organisation that you're in, or the workplace that you're operating in, or in any aspect of society, family life, or with friends, or whatever it might be. Is all that okay, Jacqui?
Yes, it's fabulous. I'm just thinking that we can discern this, can't we? Even just regular everyday people, like you tend to just be almost energetically drawn towards those people that do have that coherence. Because I think we all probably know that you can move through life and you do come across people that are vastly intellectually intelligent, but their lives might be a complete and utter mess. They don't live what they speak or know. And I think we
Yeah.
all know that. And in contrast, when you come across someone that has that level of integration, they can tell you interesting, useful things, but you see that they live their life that way, that they practice what they preach, I suppose is the common phrase that we would attach to someone like that. But you see that integration, that congruency in them, and it's quite magnetic. Like you're often attracted to those kind of people because they're living this know-how.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's correct. All right. Well, I'll continue on, Jacqui. So what's been clearly explained here is that knowledge alone is insufficient to get the job done. Put simply, knowledge won't make you realised, but without knowledge, you won't be able to become realised. There's a lovely little saying that I use to illustrate this, and it simply states that a donkey carrying a load of holly books is still a donkey. So visualise a donkey and his a means of transporting. So you got strapped to its back there boxes of Bibles, boxes of the Gita, boxes of Buddhist teachings, any of the great works. But the donkey carrying it doesn't know what he's carrying. So in that sense, a smart person that's knows physics, or knows this or knows that, or even more particularly learning this sort of material, but not putting it into practice, it's almost the equivalent that you're just carrying it between your ears and you're not doing anything with it. So it's sort of like wasted energy is, I guess, what I'm trying to say here. And I elaborate on this in the next line, where I say someone carrying a lot of truthful knowledge between their ears is using it in a very limited form, and it doesn't have a practical outcome. So that's why the emphasis is on the two being together to make this equation. And I think I've made that pretty clear now, Jacqui. So I'll continue on. So Krishna explains now to Arjuna that the self, that is himself, the eternal teacher, who from the beginning of time has instructed all the great sages, the seers, the masters, the avatars, and the gurus, who have continuously passed on his great teaching. He tells him, I have been born again and again, from time to time, as you have, Arjuna, but my births are known to me, whereas your births are not known to you. So he's describing here, or explaining briefly a bit about the wheels of birth and death and reincarnations. He says every now and again he appears, different name, different form, but still the messenger of truth, and passes it on to other avatars and sages and so on, so that they can keep passing it on to any humans that are interested in making these fundamental changes in their lives. And he says, but you don't know yours. So we have to take at face value that we've had these past lifetimes, and just accept it. And eventually it becomes a bit clearer to us and we're more certain about that. And it's not essential at this stage that anyone understands that very clearly. But that's a quote directly from the Gita that I've referred to here. And I'm now going to refer to another quote. And he further elaborates, stating that whenever Dharma, that's the universal laws, the laws of creation, God's own laws, he says, when Dharma declines and Adharma prevails in the world, I manifest myself in worldly form. In times of spiritual and moral crisis, when goodness and right actions weaken, and when evil grows stronger, I reappear as I have done now to reinvigorate my teachings so that the society can transform and uplift itself. So he's saying when consciousness observes there's an imbalance in the world, of too many people moving away from his laws, the dharma, and operating from untruth, adharma, well, then there's an imbalance in the world's population. And the people seeking truth, he realizes, would more or less be swamped. The media and the politicians and all sorts of sources would keep outweighing the energy of the person who's trying to strive and like to fight through all that. It's like you're in a heavy fog or a heavy mist, and you can't get enough clarity to know what you're doing. Does that make sense, Jacqui?
Definitely.
Okay. So he when I look across the planet, Jacqui, I see a lot of people operating from their lower self. And when a lot of people in society operate from their lower self, well, then that society or that nation tends to operate from a lower self. And you can see that quite easily, can't you, when you look around the world, how many wars there's taking place, how much greed's around the planet, how much all sorts of stuff that we know isn't right. But the people involved in it think that it's quite all right, and they press ahead in that sort of existence. And I'd just like to read a little quote, Jacqui, or a little passage from a Gita called by Swami Chidbhavananda. I'll just hold it up there. He writes beautifully.
Maybe just hold it further back a little, closer to you.
Yeah.
Oh,
The
yes.
Bhagavad Gita by Swami Chidbhavananda. Again, they've all got that's Arjuna there, that's Krishna there. You can see all the armies. I described those in one of my someone blowing a conch shell here. It's like the equivalent of bugles and beating drums, when there's wars and things like that. But he just writes, I thought it'd be useful for listeners to hear it from another text than the one or two that I've been using. And he quotes I'll read two shlokas. The first one is that whenever, shloka 7, verse 7, whenever there's decay of dharma, the universal law, and the rise of adharma, I embody myself. Yeah, takes on a physical form, like Jesus did, like Krishna did, like Buddha did. They're all the same entity, just different names. And he says, Dharma is verily the karma that is conducive to man's growth and progress. What impedes them is adharma, the untruth. And he says that every time adharma prevails on the planet and prevents man's evolution, the cosmic intelligence embodies itself as a matter of course. So this is why Krishna appeared at this stage in India's history and became a teacher for Arjuna. And he goes on then in the next paragraph, verse 8, he says, for the protection of the good, so this is us, Jacqui, you, me, and all our listeners, and other people that are doing this sort of work, trying to operate from their higher self, from their truth. That's what he's talking about. So for the protection of the good and for the destruction of the wicked and for the establishment of my universal laws, Dharma, I am born again age after age. So these great beings appear. Hermes Trismegistus was another one. Any of the great masters all come under this sort of heading. And he gives a lovely example here of weeding or farming. And he says, purgation is an unfailing process of nature. The cleansing takes place at all levels in various ways. And he says, in the agricultural field, it goes on as weeding and manuring. So most people have probably had a vegetable patch or got one or understand a bit about farming. And if you don't weed your crop, vegetable patch, for example, keep it simple, and pull out the weeds in that, well, what will invariably happen is some of the weeds will grow taller than your carrots or your tomato plants or something. So they'll prevent the sun coming in on them. And we know that sun's very important for plant growth. So in the shade, they're not going to grow as well. Even worse than that, the weeds will suck out nutrients and the moisture from the soil, which deprives the seedlings that you've got growing. So you end up with stunted tomatoes and half green tomatoes and stunted carrots and sort of distorted and all sorts of stuff. So we translate that to the human being, that if all the humans are together, and majority of them are like weeds operating from adharma, not from truth, from their mortal lower self, because they're chasing fame or money or prestige or whatever it might be, and not enough kindness, not enough goodness, not enough love, not enough all of those sorts of qualities. Well, then the people who are trying to do that, as I mentioned earlier on, would be smothered. They'd be denied oxygen, you like. They don't get as much conscious light, the light of consciousness there. It's available, but in smaller quantities and harder to find. So it makes it difficult for people. And so he's simply saying there that the consciousness takes on a mortal form, comes in to reinvigorate, so that people can start this, the people who listen to this advice can start becoming like gardeners and pulling out weeds. Now, sometimes it's a trap for people in this work, in that they go out trying to pull out weeds in other people's garden, whereas the focus should be pulling out the weeds in your own garden, so that you can grow spiritually into a full rounded ripe fruit, if you like, which in the end means a self-realized person, and be able to ignore any of the people around you that are trying to distract you or trying to turn you off the path or whatever. Everyone wants to promise you, come and have a party and come and have a good time. Here, try this little drug; it won't hurt you. You'll feel good. All of these sorts of things. Well, they're the sort of temptations and that are out there, and we all know where they are and the damage they can do. All right, Jacqui. So
I think I wonder if, sorry, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but one other thought came to mind too, was that notion of apathy, and that it's not even the temptations that we might sort of declare, overly problematic or known, but even things just like, giving our time over lazily to watching too much TV or just very inactive things when we could use the time to be self-improving or studying or just doing an activity that's a little bit more uplifting or beneficial to us in some way.
Yeah, exactly. And just that simple example. These days, the electronic devices, as good as they can be, used properly, but my observation is people in the Western world in particular, because they've got the access to most of that sort of technology, spend huge amounts of time scrolling through their iPads and constantly listening to things on their earpads and stuff like that, which makes it very difficult. That's the equivalent to the weeds. These are all distractions that, whereas we're trying to understand, be stiller, be calmer. Don't always have this movement taking place within you, mentally and emotionally, which is what most of the references are about. So, and because it's all around you, you sort of think, well, everyone else is doing it. Why shouldn't I? It must be okay, Well, you've got to understand, listeners, that it's not okay. And just because everyone else is doing it, there's no reason why you ought to be doing it or we should be doing it. We're trying to learn, anyone who's interested in the truth, how to be able to separate themselves from those sorts of temptations and lead a more balanced sort of life. Whereas my observation in general is that too many people are leaning towards adharma, the opposite of the universal laws, and not nourishing themselves enough to lead a more balanced life. We're still in this world. We've still got to live and have jobs and all of these sorts of things, but we can do it more at a balanced level. Whereas if it's out of whack, it causes the problems for the individual. So if here's a little tip for you all. If you feel a lot of stress or a lot of tension in your life, if you're often crying, if you're often angry, if you're often upset, someone said this and someone did that, and everything's hurting you, and you feel your heart's broken, and your mind's a grasshopper mind jumping everywhere, a chattering monkey mind, all this sorts of stuff. Well, that's a clear indication that you're operating from untruth, adharma. And the only remedy is listening to these sorts of podcasts, not just particularly me, but anyone who's doing truthful podcasts, reading proper material, truthful material, it's available, but not many people are using it. So I'm stressing here very strongly, Jacqui, today, aren't I, that the emphasis is on each individual, and to understand that each individual has to ultimately take responsibility for their own life and their own spiritual growth and their own spiritual journey. And to do that, you've got to apply yourself. There's blood, sweat, and tears involved. It's no free lunch. It doesn't just happen with a touch of a wand. God doesn't look down at you and say, "Oh, I like you. Here, you realise." No, that's just nonsense. Yeah. This business of you can be anything you like and do whatever you like and say whatever you like. It's a total contrary to all of the great teachings of the great masters. You can't do what you like. You can't do the only thing you can do that's advised by Krishna and the great masters is operate from the truth as often as you can whenever you remember. That's what you must do. The rest of it is made up stuff that's in everyone's mind and society's minds and saying, no, you can do this and you can do that. And it's easily proved. So those of you who are feeling quite relaxed in life and quite content, you still realise that there's some work to do to nourish yourself more spiritually, and that's why you're listening. But by and large, you're a more steady, settled sort of person. So that's an indication that you've already learned a fair bit, not only in this lifetime, but probably in previous lifetimes, and you're carrying it over and you're extending it by this sort of work. I'm really on a roll there, aren't I, Jacqui?
You are.
I've got everyone
Keep going
excited.
with it. We're sort of nearing
But
towards
Krishna
the final
goes on to
third.
say that this might be difficult for many people to comprehend. But for the few daring to learn his teachings, this is what I've just referred to. Oh, okay. Thanks. He says the few daring souls daring to learn his teachings, it's a rare opportunity to free themselves from the delusion that they are these mortal bodies. So that sums up nicely, I think, what I've just been saying. And this is a little quote directly from Krishna now. He says, purified of their selfish desires, fear and anger, devoted to me, they reach the supreme goal. Becoming one with me, like many others, they merge their existence in mine, he concludes. So it sums it up very nicely. I'm not. You seem to have frozen, Jacqui. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We've got a little bit of an internet glitch, but this is recording well, and I can hear you and see you.
Okay. Well, if you think everything's going all right, we'll continue on.
Going well. Yes. Continue.
Yep. Yeah. I can see me beautifully and I can hear me beautifully, but you're looking a bit still.
That's all right. That's all right.
Frozen, I think. Yeah. All right. So in the next section of his teachings, Krishna explains how he is the primeval cause of all actions. So what we're learning here, listeners, is that consciousness is the driving force of this entire creation. Consciousness brings it about, and consciousness sustains everything in it. And he's just teaching Krishna to understand this clearly, and we need to understand this clearly, that I can't be talking unless I've got consciousness allowing me to talk. You can't all be hearing me unless consciousness is allowing your ears to pick up on the sounds I'm making, and then to operate your mind or your emotions in whichever direction you want to go. So he says that no being can act without the self, but he makes it very clear to Arjuna that although he provides the life force, many people know it as prana, to every individual, he does not interfere with how anyone uses it in their physical, mental and emotional lives. He says, be they good or bad, spiritual or mortal. So he's saying, I provide all the power you need, but don't involve me in any of how you use it. Yeah, I'm out of the equation. I just give you it, and then what you do with it, it's up to you. And elaborate a little bit in the next section about karma and how that affects us, or what we need to be mindful of. So this can be simply illustrated by using electricity. Everyone understands electricity, Jacqui. Everyone uses electricity all around the world. It's a vital part of our life today. If there was no electricity tomorrow, within a week or two, 7 billion people would be dead. That's how important electricity is. If you don't think that's true, we'll just have a little think about it in a moment of stillness. But anyway, he says we know that all electricity comes from a source, whether it's burning coal or uranium or windmills or solar panels. It all comes from a source. And so in this sense, he's saying I'm the source. It doesn't matter where it comes from, but it's always coming from me in one direction or another. And he says that, or I'm using the example of electricity, that electricity is neutral. You don't have good or bad electricity, do you? So there's no good or bad consciousness. It's just pure consciousness. So he goes, I go on to say, using the electricity as an example to illustrate this, that the electricity enlivens whatever piece of equipment plugs into it. For example, a fridge or a TV or a toaster or light or, the TV that we're looking at now, it powers anything. And when you don't want it, you switch it off. So the consciousness powers every human being, and not only every human being, but it powers the sun, it powers the waves, it powers the wind, it powers the movement of all the planets, it powers everything in the creation. Only human beings have got the free will to use that power whichever way they want. Everything else in creation acts what's called according to divine law. So he goes on. So I go on to give a simple example here, listeners, that you can have a prison, say in America, where they still have capital punishment, and the electricity coming into the prison can power an electric chair and execute a prisoner. The building next door might be a hospital, and that same electricity is coming into that hospital, and it powers a life-saving machine or machine that saves the life of a patient that's critically ill. So can we all understand clear? That's clear, isn't it? That the same source. So a person can use that consciousness to murder someone. Another person can use that consciousness to display extreme kindness to another person that's suffering or whatever it might be. So Krishna is just simply saying, I'm neutral, but I'll give you free will so you can do with my power whatever you want. And he now goes on to explain a little bit about this section, Jacqui, and I'm mindful we've just about run out of time, so I'll go to the to our exercise. But he says, and this is an important section, I've given you free will to use my power to act, but understand that there will be karmic repercussions. Yeah, so he's making it clear to Arjuna, you can use it whichever way you like, but there'll be karmic repercussions for you accordingly as to how you use it. That is the law of what's known as the law of cause and effect, or the law of karma, or in Christian terms, it's referred to as you sow, so you shall reap. And we call it what goes around comes around, any of those sorts of references. So somewhere along the line, the law of karma, a fundamental universal law of the Creator, will come into place and will sort out all sorts of problems. Doesn't matter if judges don't do it or you don't get caught by police or whatever it might be, karma will eventually sort everything out. And he says, and understand also, he says to Arjuna, that whatever you do using my power doesn't impact on me. So he says, I'm above all of that. I just give you the power. Don't blame it onto me. So you hear people say, oh, God made me do it, or it's God's fault, or it's all this sorts of stuff, which again is all sort of total nonsense. All right, Jacqui. So I'll time to finish up. We agreed. So I'll give the listeners the exercise for today. So again, most of these exercises are going to involve putting into practice what it is we've been discussing, but very importantly, observing what happens so that we can prove to ourselves or satisfy to ourselves that it's worth continuing on and keep making the changes that we're making. So whenever you observe and whenever you remember, whether the activity observe what the activity you've just been undertaking when you remember to observe it, whether it was physical activity or mental activity or emotional activity, and remember they're all activities, was performed wisely, that is truthfully operating from your higher self. So see if you can differentiate between when you get caught up in the heat of the moment and ego says, do this and don't do that and so on and so on. That's easy enough to recognize. Or whether you've, and you, again, your reference at the beginning, Jacqui, was relevant to this homework. So yes, observe physically, mentally and emotionally, whatever the occasion was, whether you've operated wisely. You've learned something and you're putting it into practice, and this is the result. All right, Jacqui?
Beautiful. Another very valuable exercise for us all to be practicing through the course of the week. Thank you for such wonderful teachings. I'm enjoying them thoroughly, and I'm trusting that our listening audience is as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to prepare so well as you do each week and share with us all. It's fabulous. Well, thank you. Until we join together next week, take care, everybody. Thank you. Over and out.
Thank you, Jacqui, and thank you, listeners. Goodbye.
Bye.